Mark and his fiancée Daisy sat together, marveling at the beautiful ceremony. "This will be us in 5 months," Mark whispered to his fiancée, smiling. She looked back at Mark, beaming, evidently giddy with excitement. They were attending their friend's wedding, less than a half a year away from their own. Being able to enjoy a pleasant reception with their friends was a gift, a breakaway from the stress of planning their own big day. Planning had been hectic, a true whirlwind of decisions, designs, and the occasional drama. However, every passing minute at the function only reminded Mark and Daisy of their impending day, making it difficult for them to hide their exhilaration. All they could do was imagine a day as perfect as this one was, but of their own. They watched as the bride's father made a toast and the groom's brother beckoned for the microphone. The crowd went silent as he stood up, cleared his throat, and started his speech as the groom's best man. After a while, however, Mark noticed him growing overly conscious of another man in a tuxedo, presumably his friend. He was filming the best man and his date for the night, who Mark had heard was his girlfriend of 5 years. As the best man continued making light jokes and commenting on what a beautiful couple the bride and groom made, his attention then turned towards his girlfriend seated beside him. "As beautiful as today has been, I want to also dedicate a moment to the girl beside me, the love of my life. She has been there for me through all my highs and lows, and over the course of planning this wedding, all I've been able to think about is how I want to spend the rest of my life with her, starting with a day as perfect as this one of our own." He reached into his tuxedo pocket, and the crowd started shifting uneasily, mixed reactions evident on everyone's faces. The parents of the groom seemed delighted. The parents of the bride, not so much. The most prominent reaction, however, was undoubtedly from the bride herself. Her eyes widened in a mix of shock and disbelief as the groom's brother got down on one knee and dropped the big question. The girlfriend, beaming with happiness, accepted and threw herself into the best man's arms. Applause broke out amongst the groom's family, all over the moon to be witnessing the happiness of someone they loved. The bride's family, however, told a different story, murmuring uncomfortably amongst themselves. At the same time, the groom, with slight discomfort, went over to his brother and embraced him in an awkward hug. The reception continued, despite the uncomfortable air that now clouded the day. Mark couldn't help but bring up the incident on the drive home. "The poor bride," he commented, maneuvering his way around traffic to reach his parents' house, where his brother had asked to meet him after the reception was over. "She looked mortified, and I can understand why." Daisy nodded in agreement. "As soon as that happened, all the attention was off her and on the newly engaged couple. I feel awful for Brenda. She truly deserved better. Everyone deserves to be the center of attention on their big day. I don't think Brady about his brother springing that act on the day of their wedding either. He seemed pretty taken aback, didn't he?" Daisy nodded again. "I will never understand people trying to take away the spotlight from the couple on their big day." The conversation shifted to the rest of the ceremony. They commented on aspects of the wedding they enjoyed and would want to emulate at their own, and what they felt they could do better. Pulling into his parents' driveway, Mark noted through the window that his parents were seated on the couch with their brother, all with broad smiles as they chatted excitedly. Mark and Daisy entered the house, and Mark's mother greeted them excitedly. "How was the wedding?" "It was beautiful," right until the groom's brother decided it was the perfect time to make it all about himself by proposing to his girlfriend. "Can you believe it?" Daisy laughed. "Such a perfect day, and one simple act of selfishness was enough to dismantle all of it." The smiles that adorned Mark's family's faces dropped sharply. They looked at each other with uncertainty, and Daisy noticed and looked at Mark, confused. The silence was heavy, and Mark made an effort to break it by steering the conversation to the purpose of their visit. "What was it you wanted to talk to me about, Rufus?" Rufus looked at his brother and back at his parents, evidently disturbed. Why don't we sit down?" Daisy and Mark sat across from Mark's family on a sofa, and Rufus cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I want to propose to Linda at your wedding." Mark's jaw dropped. For a moment, he thought he was joking. Surely, after hearing what they had just said, he couldn't imagine that he was asking for something rational. The expressions on his parents' faces said otherwise. They looked at Mark expectantly, their faces a mixture of hope and slight shame. "You can't be serious." "I think it's perfectly fair to ask, Mark. I've been helping you so much with preparing for your wedding, and you know how much I love Linda. After 3 years of waiting, what better occasion to spring the question than in front of all the people we love? Those people are there to celebrate me and Daisy, Rufus, not you and your girlfriend. There is no way this is happening." Rufus looked at his parents with pleading eyes. They'd been silent so far, refusing to interrupt. His father finally piped in at Rufus's silent plea. "He's your brother, Mark. Let it be a special day for both of you so we can all celebrate together." Mark laughed in disbelief. In his 23 years as his parents' son, there were only 3 years where he wasn't their second priority. As soon as his brother was born, Mark took a back seat. Gifts, trips, treats, chores, if it applied to both of them, Rufus always got the longer end of the stick. As soon as the conversation came up, Mark knew his parents would be on Rufus's side. That's all they had ever done, after all. The worst part was that the favoritism was unwarranted. Rufus was rude, entitled, and selfish. Mark had found his parents, particularly his father's, constant picking on Mark and blissful ignorance of Rufus's flaws borderline abusive. All his life, he had been handed what he wanted, and it followed him all the way to college. Mark had to pick up 4 jobs throughout high school to collect enough to fund his college education. Once Rufus reached the age, his parents suddenly decided that working well in high school would be distracting and stressful. Rufus should just focus on his studies, they said. As a result, his parents funded his education. And what did he do to thank them? He dropped out, and they could never recover the money they spent on tuition. His parents then came to Mark to help them keep their house. Since then, Mark had continued to contribute a large sum of money every month to his parents' living expenses. At the same time, Rufus freeloaded off them while living under the same roof. And here they were again. Mark was finally getting something good for himself, and once again, he was being forced to share what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life with his little brother. I said no, Dad. Daisy had been quiet this whole time, watching silently as the brothers bickered. Mark's mother then piped in. Daisy, will it be fine with you? Won't you, Daisy? Daisy looked up, not knowing what to say. She had her fair share of issues with her mother-in-law, and had learned that giving in was usually the easiest way to keep the peace. Before she could say anything, however, Mark interrupted. She already told you how distasteful she found the whole situation today. Doesn't that say enough? As the fighting continued, Mark noticed Daisy muffling a silent sob next to him and decided he had had enough. Mom, Dad, this is not happening. If it does happen, I guarantee I will have Rufus dragged out of my wedding by our bouncers. I don't care that it will make a scene. Mark's father laughed incredulously. You're being ridiculous, Mark. Think about your brother for once in your life. His words stung Mark with a ferocious intensity. For once, Dad? Who's paying for half the house that keeps a roof above his selfish, insolent head? Why does what he wants always take priority over my happiness? We're grateful for the help you give us, Mark, but don't use that against us here. It's not enough to justify how stubborn you're being with your brother. Oh, it's not enough? Okay, if you don't think so, I'm going to be stopping our monthly payments unless you learn how to say no to Rufus. He earns just as much as I do. Tell him to help do something for you instead of leeching off of my income and yours. The living room was hit with a heavy silence. His parents could tell they had hit a nerve, and Rufus had chosen to take a seat back and let his parents fight his battle. Mark's father was the first to break the silence. Don't be drastic now, Mark. Let's discuss this. There's nothing to discuss, Dad. You can learn how to say no to your darling son and put your foot down for the first time in your life. If you don't want to do that, you'll need to find another way to keep this house in your possession, because I'm not going to be helping. Mark's mother burst into tears and walked off to the kitchen with her head in her hands. Rufus finally spoke up. Look what you've done, Mark. You made Mom cry. Are you happy with yourself? He walked off after his mother, and Mark sat in silence, seething in anger. The tension in the air was still palpable when Mark's father left. Daisy and Mark looked at each other, unsure how to process everything that had just happened. I won't let it happen, Daisy. I promise. Daisy took Mark's hand in hers and looked him in the eye earnestly. If this is going to cause problems for you, Mark, I'd rather just keep the peace and let them get their way. As much as I'll hate it, I don't want us not giving in to cause a permanent rift between you and your family. It's only one day after all. Years of being overlooked in favor of his little brother had hardened Mark, but he finally felt himself crack, and a tear ran down his cheek. Giving in meant more than compromising on this one day. To Mark, his wedding was finally supposed to be a day that was his. After years of neglect, his parents finally focused on what he wanted, trying to make sure he was happy on his big day. After all of that, however, he still found himself in the crossfire, having to give up what he truly wanted. His parents refused to take his side on one of the most important days of his life. It's not happening, Daisy. I mean what I say about the money. They choose to continue inflating his ego and letting him believe the world revolves around him, they're going to need to ask him to make himself deserving of their love for the first time. Rufus had landed himself a cushy job in finance despite his lack of experience and qualifications through his father. He had talked Rufus up to one of his friends who owned a banking firm. Thinking back on the conversation leading to the job, Mark couldn't help but think that the way his father described Rufus was so far from the truth that it was more accurately representing Mark himself. Despite this, Rufus somehow managed to keep the job on lock and was earning a hefty sum of money. Paired with the fact that he lived with his parents and spent no money on living expenses, Rufus's pastimes involved gambling his money away and drinking at pubs with his friends. Mark found it infuriating how easy Rufus had it. The former was still struggling to pay off his student loans while helping his parents keep a roof over his obstinate brother's head. Mark's mind was made up. He knew the backlash he would face, but he wasn't going to budge on his decision. His parents could decide what their priority was, protecting their second son's feelings or keeping their first son's unconditional support intact. Weeks passed by without mention of the proposal again. Mark continued paying his parents the monthly rent payment he always did. However, a few weeks before the wedding, Mark received a call from his mother. She wanted to meet him at his house without Mark's father or brother knowing. A few days later, Mark found himself seated across from his mother, sipping silently on a cup of coffee as she stared at the coffee table, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry." Mark looked at his mother's nervous figure, wondering what had prompted this. "Is this about the proposal, Mom? If it is, that's fine. I'm assuming you and Dad have spoken to Rufus about not having it, since he hasn't brought it up again." Mark's mother shook her head. "I tried talking to him about it, but your dad didn't back me up. Rufus hasn't given up on the idea. He plans to do it without letting you know beforehand." Mark's heart froze. Did he not take his threat of setting our security on him seriously? How stubborn could he be? He laughed in exasperation. "You do know this is what years of you and Dad letting him get away with anything has done, right?" Mark's mother nodded, and Mark realized her eyes had filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I know you've suffered all your life because of how we've treated you, and you deserve so much better. You also deserve an explanation." She set her cup of tea down and looked Mark in the eyes. "If it was up to me, I would never have treated you like that. Your dad," she paused, Rufus's dad, insisted on it if I wanted to continue being with him." "What do you mean, Rufus's dad?" Mark's mother drew a shaky breath. "When I first got together with Rupert, I was already pregnant. I know we told you that you were born out of wedlock, but the truth is, you aren't Rupert's. He said he was fine with raising you with me, but once Rufus was born, he showed me that he truly never accepted you as his own." Mark felt his heart drop. His fists clenched in disbelief as he listened to his mother go on. "When I realized how unfairly you were being treated, I brought it up with Rupert, but he refused to change. He said Rufus was his own, and he could treat him however he wanted to, and swore that if I went against him, he'd leave me to fend for myself with you." Mark's mother's voice shook. "I was selfish, but I knew I had no way of supporting myself, so I followed his lead and let Rufus do whatever he wanted. And that includes ruining the happiest day of my life?" The revelation had left Mark numb. As life-altering as it was, all he could think about was the future. Mark's mother shook her head. "That's why I'm here. Your brother is not going to change his mind, and his father is just going to encourage him. I can't let them get away with ruining your life once again, Mark. You've been hurt enough. The only way to make this work is by not allowing your brother to be there in the first place." "Uninvite him from the wedding?" Mark's mother nodded. "I don't know what Rupert will do if he finds out I told you, but you've tolerated enough. I want you to be happy, and it's about time I put your happiness before my comfort." Mark stood up from his place across from his mother and sat down beside his mother. "If Dad threatens you, you can always stay with me, Mom. Without my money, he can't keep the house anyway, and I doubt Rufus will be of any help." He hugged his mother's shaking figure. "Thank you for finally telling me. I just want you to be happy, son. To me, letting you have the wedding of your dreams is more than just about the one day. I want you to be free of us and live the life you deserve. That starts with making your perfect day." The day had finally arrived, and Mark felt lighter than he ever had before. The day was everything he and Daisy dreamt it to be. The ceremony was perfect, the vows were beautiful, the food was delicious, and the guests were enjoying themselves. Most significantly, the day had been about them. Rufus was nowhere to be seen, and the security had been told to keep an eye out for him. As the day drew to an end, Mark and his mother shared a dance and talked. "It's been 3 months since you moved out of Dad's place, hasn't it? How have you been holding up?" Mark's mother smiled. "Better than I ever thought I would. I didn't realize how heavily his demands were weighing on me. I never needed him. I just needed my son." Mark returned the smile. "I'm glad I have my mom back." Once the song was over, Mark walked over to his now wife and led her to the floor, sharing a dance to mark the end of the day of their dreams.